Recently, a re-export company based in Port Klang, Malaysia, posted a video on TikTok. In the footage, their workers were seen grinding off the fumigation marks on goods from China, trying to cover up the original country of origin. In another video, workers were shown unloading Chinese products in Malaysia and then putting Made in Malaysia labels on them. But this method, often used by Chinese companies, might not work for much longer. This tactic is called washing the origin, or country of origin laundering. It means a company from one country uses loopholes in another country's regulations by removing product labels or changing packaging so that the goods can be certified as made in that second country. On April 18th, a woman in Shenzhen shared on RedNote that something outrageous happened. She said her company has a factory in Vietnam, and they often ship materials and semi-finished tools there. Before, as long as the paperwork was complete, everything could go smoothly. But this time, customs stopped their shipment, opened up more than 2,000 semi-finished products, and said the items listed on the documents didn't match the actual goods. In the end, everything was sent back to China. Vietnam's move seems to be in response to new U.S. tariff policies aimed at preventing origin laundering. After President Trump took office, he launched a reciprocal tariff policy on April 2nd. The U.S. started setting different tariff rates for different countries and regions, with China and most Southeast Asian countries facing tariffs over 30%. The Chinese government retaliated, and after 2 rounds of tit-for-tat tariff hikes, the U.S. is now imposing a 145% tariff on most goods from China, while China is imposing a 125% tariff on most goods from the U.S. Several Southeast Asian countries said they would try to negotiate and cooperate with the U.S. to achieve mutually beneficial trade. On April 9th, Trump announced a 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs for some countries, including Vietnam, to allow time for negotiations. Even though Vietnam had earlier shown goodwill by lowering tariffs on U.S. imports, the White House refused to make similar concessions. They accused Vietnam of non-tariff cheating, saying the real problem was that China was using Vietnam to ship goods to the U.S. and avoid tariffs. Vietnam's Ministry of Industry and Trade has now issued new rules to strictly control certificates of origin and supplier materials to prevent fraud. Against the backdrop of the U.S.-China tariff war, CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping visited Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. This series of visits has drawn attention to the growing competition between China and the U.S. in Southeast Asia. During his visit to Vietnam, Xi Jinping held talks with To Lam, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam. Xi called on Vietnam to stand together against unilateral bullying and to protect global free trade and supply chain stability. His comments were clearly aimed at President Trump's global tariff policies. But Vietnam's leaders reacted cautiously to Xi's appeal, showing that they're taking a careful approach in balancing between the U.S. and China. Taiwanese media outlet Shangbao pointed out that Xi Jinping's visit to Vietnam was originally meant to build an anti-U.S. alliance, but Vietnam was not receptive. The joint statement signed by both sides was vague, mentioning only opposing hegemonism and power politics. This kind of language has been commonly used by Vietnam in the past, often implying criticism of China's actions in the South China Sea. Xi Jinping's visit to Vietnam caught the attention of President Trump. In the White House, Trump told reporters that Xi's meeting with Vietnamese leaders was intended to harm the U.S. However, after Xi Jinping left Vietnam, a message released on Vietnam's government website on April 18th stated that Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh had met with Jeffrey Perlman, chairman of the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council. During the meeting, Pham said that Vietnam and the U.S. shared a unique bond, and that the relationship between the two countries was different from relations with other countries. According to the Vietnamese government's announcement, Pham Minh Chinh also stated that Vietnam had largely addressed U.S. concerns by proactively cutting taxes and increasing imports of American goods, and the country was ready to engage in discussions and negotiations. He added that Vietnam seeks to establish a sustainable, balanced trade relationship with the U.S. In recent years, the U.S. has become Vietnam's most important export market. Vietnam is a major production base for many Western companies, and last year its trade surplus with the U.S. exceeded $123 billion US. Regarding Xi's visit to Vietnam, Chinese state media reported that China and Vietnam signed 45 cooperation agreements, covering areas like artificial intelligence, railways, and agricultural products. These agreements include China investing in railway construction and exporting AI technology. However, political commentator Tang Jingyuan pointed out that while Xi's visit appeared grand, the actual gains were limited. Most of the 45 agreements were one-sided concessions from China, such as China funding the railways and exporting AI technology, with Vietnam contributing little. Tong said that while Vietnam would not refuse these benefits offered by China, it is unwilling to take risks for China's origin laundering practices. Vietnam is well aware that its economic prosperity depends on the U.S., not China. Just 2 days after Trump initiated the tariff hikes on April 4th, Vietnamese Communist Party General Secretary To Lam held a phone call with President Trump. Trump later said that To Lam had promised that if an agreement were reached, Vietnam would reduce tariffs on U.S. goods to zero. The Vietnamese government stated that Trump and To Lam agreed to continue talks to sign a bilateral tariff agreement as soon as possible, and added that Trump had accepted an invitation to visit Vietnam soon. On April 6th, China and Cambodia held a joint military exercise at the newly expanded Rang Naval Base in the Gulf of Thailand. This base, located in Cambodia, was renovated with Chinese funding, and the U.S. has expressed concerns that it may become a Chinese military outpost. Taiwanese scholar Song Guoxiang stated that Cambodia has a pro-China political stance and relies on Chinese-funded infrastructure and aid. It is also one of the few countries in the region that supports China's position on the South China Sea. Cambodia is unlikely to break away from China, but will likely see low-profile engagement with the U.S. to avoid sanctions. Sun Guoxiang stated that while the Chinese Communist Party tries to promote regional cooperation, even forming an anti-U.S. alliance in some cases, ASEAN countries have chosen to keep their distance, showing that these Southeast Asian countries place more importance on their trade relationships and market opportunities with the U.S. Taiwanese scholar Shen Mingshi said that Southeast Asian countries base their decisions on their own national interests. In the past, they used to say, economy depends on China, security depends on the U.S. Now, security has likely become even more important, but the degree of economic reliance on China may gradually decrease. Shen Mingshi also noted that before Xi Jinping's visit to Vietnam, ASEAN countries had already made a decision to take a negotiating and cooperative approach towards the U.S.'s tariff policies, rather than retaliating. Essentially, these countries want to maintain access to the U.S. market and avoid siding with the CCP. Professor Shi Yinhong from Renmin University of China believes that Southeast Asian leaders are aware that if they align too closely with the CCP, they could face punishment from Trump. China expert Wang He stated that for ASEAN, the economic appeal of the U.S. far outweighs that of the CCP. The overall non-alignment stance of ASEAN is difficult for the CCP to sway. The two sides might negotiate on free trade area cooperation and economic integration, but it's unlikely that ASEAN countries will again become a stepping stone for Chinese products to reach the U.S. The U.S. will certainly block that route during bilateral negotiations with ASEAN. To address the issue of Chinese goods being rerouted through Southeast Asia to bypass tariffs, the U.S. is intensifying scrutiny of certificates of origin and blocking transshipment trade. Several Southeast Asian countries have already taken concrete actions. Not only has Vietnam tightened controls on certificates of origin and raw materials, but Singapore's Customs and Ministry of Trade and Industry also issued an official statement, making it clear that the government will not tolerate companies intentionally using their connection with Singapore to evade or violate export controls from other countries. Appropriate actions will be taken against companies and individuals engaged in fraudulent or dishonest activities or attempting to evade export controls. Thailand's Department of Foreign Trade Director publicly stated that 42 types of products were recently found to be misusing Thai certificates of origin to bypass high U.S. and European tariffs, particularly aluminum foil and electric bicycles. The Cambodian government is developing new procedures and plans to control and prevent other countries from using Cambodia as a transshipment point for goods destined to the U.S. On April 16th, a working group led by Cambodian Deputy Prime Minister Sun Chanthol held the first round of trade talks with U.S. Representative Robert Lighthizer via video conference. Cambodia hopes to convince the U.S. to abandon plans to impose high tariffs on Cambodian goods. Under President Trump's reciprocal tariff policy, Cambodian goods are subject to tariffs as high as 49%, higher than neighboring Laos and Vietnam. Casey Barnett, president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Cambodia, AmCham, told the media that if the U.S. Trade Representative sees Cambodia as a transshipment point for Chinese goods entering the U.S., it would be very detrimental to Cambodia. According to reports from foreign media, Malaysia's Minister of Trade and Minister of Finance are scheduled to visit the U.S. by the end of April to negotiate tariffs with the Trump administration. The Trump administration has imposed a 24% tariff on Malaysian goods, which will be delayed for 90 days. However, a 10% general tariff remains in place. Malaysia has stated that it will not implement retaliatory tariffs. The Malaysian government has repeatedly urged Chinese companies not to use Malaysia as a transshipment point to avoid U.S. tariffs. A Chinese blogger pointed out that in the past, transshipment trade has been in a gray area and on the margins, but now multiple countries have started to strictly inspect transshipment practices. Products must be produced and manufactured in the country to obtain certificates of origin. This means that transshipment trade is becoming more difficult to carry out. Another blogger in the foreign industry trade warned that many Southeast Asian countries have incomplete raw material supply chains, and many are directly importing from China for further processing. If you want to export these goods to the U.S. from third countries, you must obtain local certificates of origin. If the raw material composition doesn't meet the requirements, the goods may be deemed made in China and will not qualify for tariff preferences. This policy has put Chinese companies in a tough spot, as much of their production capacity and raw materials are concentrated in China. But now they're required to source locally, which is very difficult for these businesses. The blogger gave examples of products under strict inspection, many of which are areas where China's industrial chain is highly developed, such as honey, steel pipes, sinks, motors, generators, fiberglass, saw blades, and refrigerators. This policy targets Southeast Asia, but the U.S. is also preparing a strong plan to crack down on third-party transshipment. One key part of this plan is the establishment of a global goods tracking system, which will monitor goods from the first country to the second, third, and fourth countries. This means that in the future, even if you simply change a label or alter the certificate of origin, it will no longer be easy to sell products in the U.S. market. The blogger mentioned that the purpose of implementing this tracking system is to impose joint punishment on transshipment trade. Once a company is found to be engaging in transshipment, all related companies in that country may face a direct suspension of their exports to the U.S. The goal is to deter businesses from taking risks with extreme measures. Another blogger pointed out that the U.S.'s tariff policy against China is no longer a single-point attack, but has formed a comprehensive encircling blockade. He explained that the U.S. tariff policy against China not only targets bulk goods, but also affects small packages under $800. The newly implemented tariff system requires businesses to provide a complete production flowchart from raw materials to manufacturing and transportation, strengthening monitoring of the entire supply chain. In the future, almost every link in the supply chain must be scrutinized before Chinese goods can enter the U.S. market. Additionally, starting May 2nd, small packages from China and Hong Kong, valued at less than $800, will be subject to tariffs if they are sent to U.S. individuals. The common method of splitting large shipments into small ones will no longer be able to evade tariffs. The U.S. has also taken further actions against Chinese vessels. Regardless of the cargo's origin, Chinese-owned ships docking at U.S. ports must face high docking fees, potentially in the millions of dollars. The blogger said that the U.S. tariff policy is logically interconnected. First, there are the tariffs, followed by the establishment of new systems and strict supply chain inspections. Then there are restrictions on packages and vessels, with countries cooperating to implement a transshipment blockade. All of these measures together effectively close off the possibility of Chinese goods being exported to the U.S. through multiple channels. As Southeast Asian countries cooperate with U.S. policies and strengthen security and restrictions on Chinese-made products, the blogger advised Chinese foreign trade professionals to give up the fantasy of waiting for China-U.S. negotiations and start looking for alternative solutions as soon as possible. Some people believe that the U.S. tariff issue isn't that serious, but the blogger warned that many people will not be able to endure the pressure.
We have a very close relationship with the US, and suddenly decoupling will certainly have a deep impact. There's a saying that the sky won't fall, but for many foreign trade people, especially those in the middle class, they still have to pay their mortgages and car loans. This is already putting huge pressure on our current lives.
The blogger pointed out that in Shanxi, Henan, and Hunan provinces, exports to the U.S. account for between 22% to 28% of the region's total exports. If China and the U.S. decouple, it will significantly impact the local economy, potentially leading to mass unemployment and affecting residents' income and consumption. Additionally, related industries like restaurants and services will also be affected. In Shenzhen, the annual export value to the U.S. exceeds 440 billion RMB, involving more than 4,400 companies, including many small and medium-sized enterprises and cross-border e-commerce businesses. However, the U.S. has begun taxing small packages under $800, adding new pressure on cross-border sellers. In Shanghai, there are 22,000 companies involved in exports to the U.S. Although local governments have proposed strategies for shifting foreign trade to domestic sales, China already faces issues with overcapacity and weak demand. Whether shifting to domestic sales can truly absorb foreign trade capacity remains uncertain, and the core issue will depend on whether residents have the income and confidence to support consumption. Zhejiang is also heavily affected. Many business owners in the region engage in global trade and have set up factories or businesses in Mexico, Southeast Asia, or even Europe. If they lose the U.S. market due to tariffs, orders flowing back to China will decrease, further impacting the domestic supply chain. The blogger concluded that the U.S. tariffs have already caused long-term damage to China's foreign trade businesses and individual economies. He reminded individuals and companies to face reality as soon as possible, avoid risks, and adjust strategies. The latest news reports that on April 21st, the Korea Customs Service announced that it had recently uncovered multiple cases of Chinese companies labeling products as made in Korea and exporting them to the U.S. The total value of these cases exceeded $20 million. This comes just before high-level talks between the two countries. Additionally, according to Japanese media reports, in recent years, a large number of Chinese people have set up corporate entities in Tokyo, Osaka, and other cities. There, they assemble, test, or repackage products from China to label them as made in Japan and then export them to the U.S. to avoid tariffs. This has attracted attention from Japanese netizens. Some have called on Japanese authorities to take action to block such violations, warning that Japan, like Southeast Asia, could become a target of the U.S.'s reciprocal tariffs. Analysts believe that this trend of cleaning up Chinese companies and preventing origin laundering may become a global trend, and more Chinese goods are likely to be returned by customs in other countries. The Chinese economy will likely suffer further under Trump's tariff war. Losing its economic foundation and risking public discontent, the CCP regime may eventually collapse.